The story I'm going to tell you today happened in a nearby village of where I grew up. And while it didn't happen at the time when I was there, it actually had happened 50 years before that, it still hits home pretty hard because this is one of those stories that you think that it could only happen in movies. Viewers' discretion is advised because I will be showing you some pictures from the crime scene, and while you can find these images freely on the internet, I still wanted to give you a warning anyway. Before we get started, a quick intro. My name is Andrea Scott, and I've always been fascinated by people, places, and events that are, slightly out of the ordinary. And particularly growing up, I would learn many crazy and unbelievable stories that either happened within my family or to people around us. And over the years, I would have shared these with my closest of friends. But what I've always really wanted to do is share them with wider audiences. And so this is exactly what I'm planning to do now. So if this is something that might be of interest to you, then please do stick around because there are so many exciting videos coming soon. And by the end of this video, if you liked it, then please consider subscribing, liking it, and also drop me a comment down below. Now, grab yourself a nice hot cup of cocoa and let's get started. It was year 1949 and a young woman named Drahomira was getting ready to be married later that day. Now you need to understand that where she was living at the time, it is a very rural part of the Czech Republic. And while today there are certain activities you can do all year round, back in the day there really wasn't that much to do. And so many folks, they married really young and they sort of dedicated their life taking care of their families. So as Drahomira was putting on her dress, she was full of hope that, her soon-to-be husband would make the perfect partner and a perfect father because they have been in a relationship for the past year, but now also shared a little boy. And to Drahomira, there was nothing more important than their little growing family. Josef was a manual labor worker, and he lived quite close in a nearby village. And a year earlier, the pair began dating after Josef completely fell head over heels for Drahomira's beauty. However, there was one thing Drahomira was very aware of, and that was the fact that her parents did not really share her enthusiasm in marrying Josef. And that's because he was really well known to have a short temper, and people were kind of avoiding him because he was always being caught in these arguments with them and even fights, but not Drahomira. And especially now, since they started a little family together, she really wanted this relationship to work. And so the pair exchanged their vows later on that day, and a few months after the wedding, they settled in a nearby village in a small, modest house, and their newlyweds kind of started a life together. However, sometime after the wedding, Drahomira began to question her decision in marrying Josef. Josef thought that, for some reason, Drahomira was cheating on him. And while she was certainly a beauty, with her long, sleek hair and big, bright eyes, she would never dream of cheating on her husband because they were sharing their life together now and they had a small child, and there was nothing more important than that. And soon enough, their small family began to grow, and by 1958, they had 6 children together. But as you can probably imagine, their life was far away from being perfect. Over the years, Josef's behavior really worsened, and he began lashing out even at his own family, so Drahomira and the kids. He suffered from extreme paranoia, and he thought that everyone out there was there to hate him, and they really wanted him to fail at everything, and he just didn't trust anybody. So he started picking up all these arguments and fights, and so over time, the family would have to move around quite a lot, and wherever they went, nobody really wanted to do anything with them, so they never really had the proper chance to settle down or have friends. As they were living this very secluded life away from everybody else, Josef was still convinced that his wife was having an affair. And so he began punishing her by not giving her enough money to provide for the kids, and he was also beating her and raping her. Now we can only really speculate how many of those 6 children were not a byproduct of Josef raping his wife. Josef would often beat his wife to the point where she was lying on the floor in her own pool of blood. And then he scooped her up and carried her over to their bedroom where he lay her down and he would sob and cry, and he would promise that he would change and he would get better, and then he would stop assaulting her and the kids. And ultimately she would believe him. She would always take him back and she would forgive him, because she thought that there was nothing better for the kids than to have the family together. But of course the children could see all of this as well, and they would always take their mother's side and they tried protecting her, especially the oldest son Joschka, who was now coming of age, and he was strong enough as well to kind of oppose his father even physically. Josef would often wait for Joschka to leave and then he would assault his wife, because then there was nobody else to oppose him. By the late 1950s, Josef's behavior got so out of the hand that he attacked one of his colleagues with an axe. And so police was called to the scene, who handcuffed Josef and they took him away, and eventually he would face the court. But unfortunately, at that occasion, he was not given any jail time. This incident, however, did not stop Josef in his behavior whatsoever. Shortly after, he was facing yet another hearing because he was convinced of raping a young local woman. But even then, as he was serving his 2-year sentence that he got for this act, still nothing was changing about his demeanor. And when he was released, he continued humiliating and beating his own wife, and then he even tried raping Drahomira's own sister, Vladina. Drahomira knew something was going to have to change. And so, when he was released in 1966, he came back to an empty house, as Drahomira was finally gone. The only thing left in the house were the children, because Drahomira felt that Joschka, the eldest, was now fully capable of taking care of himself and the younger siblings while they were attending their school. And so Drahomira packed her bags and moved into her parents' house. Now she did want to come back for the children when she secured some sort of a line of work and when she had a place safe and big enough for all of them to live in. But for the time being, she sort of accepted that they had to be living with their father. Ultimately, Drahomira filed for divorce and was fully hoping that Josef would be cooperative. But when Josef found out that the love of his life was planning to abandon him and sever all ties with him, he went completely mad and crazy and felt that this was the biggest betrayal she could have ever done to him. He continued to live in the house with the children, but at every opportunity he had, he would travel to the nearby village where she was staying in order to plead with her, and he was trying to lure her out so that they could talk, because he knew that based on previous events, if he could sit her down and tell her how sorry he was and that he was going to make all these promises of changing again, that she would believe him like she had done so many times before. But this time, whenever he would come over, she would refuse to see him, and so there was really nothing he could do about that. The time was drawing nearer to the hearing, which was set to take place on the 28th of February 1967, and Drahomira knew that the sooner this hearing would be over, the marriage would be over, and maybe then her and the kids could finally settle into the routine that they had never really had a chance to have before. And while they were so very excited about the prospect of having a happier life, and they were so ready to leave this dark and gruesome period of their life behind, it would come with certain sacrifices. One of them, Joschka, the oldest son, would probably have to leave the school and start earning, because at the time they really didn't have any income coming in. But nevertheless, everybody remained really positive about their future, because they thought that for the first time in their life, something good was bound to happen. But unfortunately, all their hopes would come crashing down on the morning of the 27th of February 1967. Josef, who was finally coming to the realization that soon he might lose his family, made the decision to make one last attempt to reason with Drahomira and convince her to come back to him and the kids. And so, in the morning of the 27th, he decided to skip work. He took his 2 daughters with him, and he went over to Drahomira's parents' house. And when they got there, Drahomira took the kids in, but she completely refused to speak to Josef. This made him very angry, but he didn't really know what to do about it. And so, for hours and hours, he would just begin pacing back and forth in front of the house in a hope that eventually Drahomira would come out to speak to him. But as the day was drawing to its end, and Josef knew that the hearing would be happening the next day, shaking with anger, he decided there and then that if he cannot have his wife, nobody can. And so, for the last time, he looked up at the house and into the window where he knew Drahomira was behind. He turned around and began walking back into the house. Now, this whole time, Drahomira was watching her husband because she was so afraid of what he might potentially do. She knew him so well at this point that, because he didn't get what he came for, she had a very strong sense of feeling that something was about to go wrong. And unfortunately, she was right. It was shortly after midnight when Josef reached his house, where his 4 boys were sleeping on the first floor in the bedroom. He went straight through the house into the yard, as there was a small shed where he kept his tools. And there was the very weapon that he had already picked up before, and his mind was so set on using this time, his axe. Josef wrapped his fingers around the cold wooden handle, and he began walking back into the house. There he did not even hesitate and climbed up the stairs to the first floor and slowly opened the door to the bedroom where his 4 boys were sleeping. Then he crossed the room until he was standing over his oldest son, Joshka. Earlier that evening, Joshka ordered his siblings to go to bed fully clothed and with their shoes on as well, because just like his mother, he also had this feeling that something bad might happen to them later on. And so everybody agreed, and they turned into their bedroom, and all the boys tried to stay awake for as long as possible, just to wait out their father's return. But ultimately, everybody would fall asleep, and even Joshka, who really tried his best to stay awake for as long as he could, because he was really the only one that could oppose his father, eventually felt too tired as well, and he too fell asleep. Josef raised his axe, and with one smooth and fast movement, he struck his son into his head, killing him instantly. Now this happened so fast and without really any sound that it didn't wake up any of the other boys. And so Josef retrieved his now bloodied axe, he moved over to his next son's Zdeněk, and there again he swung the weapon in a swift motion and struck him in the head. He then proceeded to do the same to his next son Karel. However, this scene turned out not to be a silent one anymore, because as he struck his 3rd son, he cried out as the axe hit him and now was lying on the floor. This commotion woke Luděk up, and so Josef turned around to him and quickly wanted to lunge at him, but Luděk instinctively puts his arms up and he tries to really protect himself. And so Josef strikes him first into the arms, and as Luděk is no longer able to defend himself, Josef hits his 9-year-old son into the head. After Josef was finished murdering his sons, he decided it was time to return to the place where Drahomira was staying, and he would deal with her there. So he left the house and aimed for the place of where he worked, because he knew he could steal a tractor to get to the house much quicker. And by the time he got there, he was driving off, but was stopped by a policeman who is inquiring, what are you doing here at 4 o'clock in the morning, and how come you got this tractor when everything else is parked away? But Josef stayed calm, and he explained that in fact there was a lot of harvesting to do, and so he had to get up extra early that day. And even though that this was February and it did probably feel a little bit fishy, he just let him go. And so Josef drove out to the main road, and by 5 o'clock in the morning he was just a few 100 meters away from the property, but one of his tires got punctured. Now you need to understand that these vehicles, they make a lot of noise. And so, at 5 o'clock in the morning, where there isn't really much else happening around, the sound of the motor would really travel far, and it would probably wake whoever was nearby up. And it actually did. It woke Drahomira, her sister, and the mother up. And so the women were trying to figure out where the sound was coming from and why it suddenly stopped. And so they left their house, but it was still quite early in the morning, so they couldn't really see anything. And so after a few minutes of just looking around and trying to figure out what was happening, they just, turned around and walked back into the house. Now Vladina had to go to work that morning, and because she was so afraid that whoever was out there might have been Josef, she asked Drahomira whether she would mind to walk her to the bus station. And so the 2 women got ready and they left the house, and eventually they would reach the bus station, and Drahomira watched as the bus came by. Vladina would get on and it would slowly drive her off. Then Drahomira, as she was starting to feel a little bit calmer, she returned to the house and she went back to bed and fell asleep. A little later, Marie, who was Drahomira's mom, she heard some steps outside of the property. And because she was still worried that whoever was out there might be getting into the house, she hurried to the main door to lock it. But in that very moment, Josef swings it open, and with his axe in his hand, he swings for Maria's head. She cried in agony, but before she hit the floor, she still managed to shout at her daughter to run. Now, Drahomira was actually woken up by all of this commotion that was happening downstairs in the kitchen. And when her mother screamed at her, she didn't hesitate a second and leapt out of the window and began running towards the nearest neighbor's house. After a few seconds, Drahomira's father, Jindřich, he comes running into the kitchen to see what was going on, and there he sees his wife in the pool of blood on the floor. But there is nothing he can do. He doesn't have a weapon, and he's much slower and also not as strong as Josef is. And so once again, Josef would reach for his axe and attack Jindřich, killing him instantly. Now, after Josef attacked Jindřich, he could see that Drahomira was running across the yard to the neighbors. And so he bolted out of the house and started chasing after his wife. He would eventually caught up to her and he would stop her, and there was a lot of kicking and screaming as she was trying to free herself because she was so terrified of, what could potentially happen to her. But ultimately he would overcome her and he would drag her back into the house, and there he would show her off the gruesome scene he's just after committing. And in fact, he tells her, "Look at what's coming to you. I'm going to cut you up to pieces." When Drahomira saw her parents lying on the floor, dripping in blood, she completely lost it. She started screaming and kicking. She wanted to free herself so much. But the only thing that this resulted in was that it woke the two girls upstairs, who came running into the kitchen in their mother's aid. Libushka, who got into the kitchen first, saw what was happening, and because they had seen her mom and dad fighting before, she stood between her parents and she tried stopping her father. But that also didn't stop Josef from attacking either of them, and so his 9-year-old daughter also fell to the floor dead. After this, Drahomira actually managed to leap onto Josef and get the axe away from him, but unfortunately she didn't manage to do anything with it, and so it was dropped onto the floor. But that very moment, both Drahomira and her last remaining daughter, Elena, the moment to escape. So Drahomira ran up to the attic and she climbed out of the small window and hid behind the chimney on the roof. Elena, on the other hand, she ran out of the house and to the nearby neighbor, who was a 17-year-old Anna. And when she reached the house, Anna was kind of just sitting there, looking at Elena, who was crying and who was very upset. And she was trying to ask her, what's happened to you? Why are you here alone? Why are you crying? And Elena tried telling Anna what was happening back at her grandparents' house, but she was so upset that she was not able to. And so Anna, when she saw how shook Elena was, she decided to go over to the house and investigate herself. She wasted no time and rushed over there, and when she got inside, she saw the bodies lying about and there was blood everywhere, and there in the middle of it all, there he stood, Josef. So Anna yelled at him to, stop whatever he was doing and that she was going to report him and call the police, which obviously made him even angrier. And so he leaped at Anna and hit her first with the axe, and then when she fell to the floor, he began stabbing at her with the rifle's head he just found in the nearby dresser. Now Anna did try to lessen any blows, and she ultimately managed to stumble out of the house into the backyard. But because she was so badly beaten up, she just kind of lost her strength and fell to the floor. And there, in a complete frenzy, Josef catches up to her and he's still stabbing her and kicking her even after she's dead. And when he's finally finished with her, he knows it's time to go after his wife. And so he goes back into the house and onto the attic, and he tries to go through the small window as well, but he's not really managing because he's so much bigger than Drahomira. And so he's screaming at Drahomira to come out and come to him, and that, nothing was going to happen to her and they could talk it over. But Drahomira's not moving. She's so afraid and shocked, and so she's not budging. Now, in the meantime, Drahomira's mother, Maria, covered in blood but not dead, manages to crawl out of the house and flags a nearby neighbor who was just happening to be passing by. And so he comes into the house and he sees Jindřich and Libushka lying on the floor, and so he shouts at Josef to stop, but Josef kinda ignores him and he just chucks a couple of roofing tiles at him. And so the neighbor leaves the house and hops onto his motorbike to go into the village and go to the police station to report this. When Josef realized that he probably will not be able to reach his wife because he's just not fitting through this small window, he changes his plan and he decides to take his own life instead. And so he finds a small rope and he ties it around one of the attic beams, but his attempt is unsuccessful because either the rope was too long or it was just too weak to support his body weight. And so he picks himself up and walks out of the house into the yard and to the nearby pond, and there he's trying to hit himself with the axe 8 times into the head. But again, he survives this, and so he knows he really has no other choice but run away. And so Josef stumbles out of the pond and he starts heading for the woods. Now he knows he doesn't really have anywhere to go because he doesn't have a means of transportation, and he knows that police will be soon or already are on their way to the property. But that didn't really matter to him because he knew where he was headed to, the quarry Hotberg. Now it would take him a couple of hours to reach it, but when he finally did and walked over to the edge, he took a last deep breath, and at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning of the 28th of February 1967, Josef Svoboda, who's just after committing 7 murders, including 5 of his own children, jumps. Now, up until 1973, Josef Svoboda remained the man who mass murdered the largest amount of people in the Czech Republic, back then known as Czechoslovakia. His little boy Karel, who didn't die at the scene, sadly passed away when he was being transported to the hospital. Maria, Elena and Drahomira would make a full physical recovery, but unfortunately Drahomira would be then hospitalized into a mental institution and she would never recover mentally. Now, my own family's acquaintance, they bought the house years after the murder of the 4 boys took place. And while they didn't report that there was something strange happening within the walls, like you would probably imagine it would be in a house with such a terrible history of violence, they did say that while they were undergoing renovations, the walls underneath the wallpaper that since had been installed still bore the red streaks of the blood that soaked them 50 years earlier. And so that's it for today, guys. Now do let me know in the comments below what you would do if you saw a madman running at you with an axe. I would love to know what you could come up with. Until next time.